humiliated at an expensive restaurant. But 30 minutes later, the chef realized he had lost everything. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching us from. The evening air was crisp as the last traces of autumn clung to the quiet streets of Queens. Inside a modest brick house, the warm glow of a single lamp spilled across the living room, casting gentle shadows on the framed photographs lining the walls. Each frame told a story. Black and white images of a young couple in the early 70s, smiling shyly in front of a church, snapshots of children blowing out birthday candles, graduation photos, and, most recently, pictures of grandchildren grinning wide with missing front teeth. Henry Walker stood near the mirror in the hallway, his hand steady as he buttoned his charcoal gray blazer. It was old, older than some of his grandchildren, but it had been carefully maintained, the fabric brushed and pressed with the kind of precision that spoke to Henry's quiet pride in the details. He adjusted his collar with deliberate care, studying his own reflection. His hair was silver now, close-cropped, with faint lines etched into his brow, but his bearing was unmistakable. Straight-backed, dignified, and calm. His skin, dark and weathered, spoke of long years of work and endurance, of life lived under the sun and fluorescent kitchen lights alike. In the adjoining room, his wife Elizabeth hummed softly as she fastened a pearl earring. At 70, she still carried herself with the same grace that had first caught Henry's eye half a century earlier. Her dress was simple but elegant, navy blue with a modest neckline, and she smoothed its hem nervously. She caught Henry's gaze in the mirror and smiled faintly, though her eyes held the same worry they'd carried all day. "Are you sure about this, Henry?" she asked softly, her voice carrying both affection and unease. "That place, it's not like it used to be. It's all rich folks now. I don't want us to feel out of place." Henry stepped toward her, his expression calm, reassuring. He took her hand gently and kissed her knuckles, the way he always had when she was anxious. "Tonight isn't about them, Liz," he said in his deep, steady voice. "It's about us. 50 years. I don't care if we're sitting in the fanciest room in New York or at a diner counter down the street. It's our night." Elizabeth's lips curved into a reluctant smile. 50 years, she echoed, as if saying it aloud would make it real. Henry's eyes drifted toward the small wooden table near the sofa. Resting there was a thin, worn-out magazine clipping preserved beneath the glass of its frame. It was yellowed with age, but still legible. A photograph of a restaurant with its original sign, Maison d'Or, and a brief article praising its founder, Chef Lucas Bennett. Henry's gaze softened. He could still see himself in that photograph, not in the frame, but just outside it. A young man, barely 20, washing dishes in the kitchen behind those walls, dreaming of someday standing in front of that stove, wielding knives with skill and pride. That dream had been interrupted, first by bills, then by the birth of their first child, and later by the relentless march of life. He hadn't stepped foot inside Maison d'Or in decades. Back then, it had been a humble French bistro tucked away on a quiet Manhattan street, run by Bennett himself, a man who, despite the prejudices of the era, had taken Henry under his wing and taught him what little time had allowed. Now, after years of growth and reinvention, it was one of the most celebrated restaurants in the city, its reputation gilded by wealth and exclusivity. Henry turned back to Elizabeth and smiled. "It's been too long since we've seen the place," he said. "I want to remember it the way it was. Maybe even see if some of it's still there." Elizabeth tilted her head, studying him. She knew what he meant, not the decor or the menu, but the feeling, the warmth, The sense of belonging he used to talk about when he came home late from those shifts, still smelling of garlic and rosemary, telling her stories of Chef Bennett's quiet wisdom and the camaraderie of the kitchen. By the time the taxi arrived, the sun had already dipped below the skyline, leaving only a faint indigo glow over the city. Henry held the door open for Elizabeth, helping her in with a tenderness that had never dulled, then slid in beside her. As the cab pulled away from their quiet neighborhood, the streets began to change. Modest homes gave way to wider roads, then to the glittering avenues of Manhattan. Billboards loomed overhead, flashing bright colors across glass windows, and the sidewalks bustled with crowds wrapped in designer coats and sharp suits. Elizabeth pressed closer to Henry, her hand slipping into his. He gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Remember our first anniversary?" she asked, a smile tugging at her lips. Henry chuckled. "How could I forget? I cooked you that steak in our old apartment, nearly smoked the place out." "You burned it black," she teased gently. "And you ate every bite," he replied with a laugh. Elizabeth's laughter joined his, soft and warm. For a moment, the taxi seemed to shrink the world to just the two of them, as it always had been. Yet, as they approached Midtown, the sight of towering skyscrapers and glittering marquees brought Henry back to the present. He stared out at the city lights, his expression growing thoughtful. So much had changed. He thought of Lucas Bennett, his old mentor, long since passed, and wondered what the man would think of the restaurant now. Would he be proud of how far it had come, or disappointed in what it might have become? When the cab finally turned onto the street where Maison d'Or stood, Henry felt a pang in his chest. The restaurant was almost unrecognizable from the modest bistro he remembered. A gleaming facade of glass and steel stretched high above, with valet attendants in crisp uniforms stationed out front. A line of expensive cars, sleek European sedans and polished sports coupes waited by the entrance. Above it all, in bold illuminated letters, the name shone, Maison d'Or. Henry paid the driver and stepped out, then turned to help Elizabeth. She hesitated for a heartbeat, glancing nervously at the glittering crowd gathered near the doors before letting him steady her arm. Together, they walked toward the entrance. The plush, red carpet underfoot seemed to stretch endlessly, and the warm glow spilling from the glass doors framed the silhouettes of impeccably dressed patrons laughing over glasses of champagne. Elizabeth exhaled shakily, her grip on Henry's arm tightening. "Henry," she murmured, "we don't belong here." He looked down at her and smiled faintly. "We belong anywhere we choose to be," he said. With that, he pushed open the heavy glass doors. A rush of warmth and soft music greeted them along with the delicate scent of truffle and butter carried on the air. Henry took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the lavish dining room. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and polished marble floors gleamed underfoot. It was beautiful, yes, but cold. There was no trace of the humble, bustling kitchen he remembered, no sign of the man who'd once taught him to dice onions with precision while humming jazz tunes under his breath. He straightened his shoulders. Tonight, he told himself, he wasn't here for the glamour or the people staring. He was here for her, for Elizabeth, for 50 years of love and loyalty, and for a quiet promise to himself to see the past one last time. And so, hand in hand, the walkers stepped deeper into the gilded world of Maison d'Or, unaware of the storm that awaited them beyond its polished doors. The doors closed softly behind them, sealing Henry and Elizabeth into a world so far removed from the life they had left just an hour earlier that it almost felt like stepping onto another planet. The air was perfumed with the scents of butter, seared meat, and expensive wine, undercut by a faint hint of polished wood and fresh flowers. The murmur of refined conversation drifted through the room, punctuated by the occasional tinkle of crystal glasses meeting in polite toasts. A pianist played softly in a corner, his fingers gliding across the keys with elegant precision, filling the restaurant with a smooth, almost hypnotic melody. Elizabeth hesitated just inside the entrance, clutching Henry's arm with more force than she realized. She had expected elegance, but not this level of opulence. It was overwhelming. Vaulted ceilings with intricate moldings, gold-framed mirrors reflecting the glow of chandeliers, and waitstaff gliding silently across the room like dancers, each movement practiced and perfectly timed. The guests, men in tailored suits, women in designer dresses, spoke in low, confident voices, their laughter controlled, as though even amusement here had to be restrained and measured. Henry's gaze wandered over the details with calm curiosity rather than awe. He noted how every table was precisely spaced, how the white tablecloths were crisp and immaculate, how each place setting gleamed under the light. Yet, beneath all that polish, something felt sterile. The warmth he remembered from long ago was gone. This was not the bustling, welcoming maison d'or he had once known. This was something else entirely, a stage set for the wealthy to dine and display themselves. A tall man approached them, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble floor. He was impeccably dressed, his tuxedo perfectly fitted, his hair slicked back with clinical precision. His name tag read Vincent, though he didn't bother to introduce himself. Instead, he regarded them with a professional smile so thin it barely masked the flicker of disdain in his eyes. His gaze swept over Henry's neatly pressed but plainly outdated blazer, then over Elizabeth's modest dress, lingering just a fraction too long before snapping back to their faces. "Good evening," Vincent said smoothly, his voice laced with the kind of condescension that pretends to be courtesy. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" Henry returned his smile politely. "No, we don't," he said evenly. "We were hoping to enjoy a quiet dinner for two. It's our anniversary." Vincent's smile didn't falter, but there was an almost imperceptible tightening around his mouth, a slight lift of his brows. "I see. Unfortunately, Maison d'Or is fully booked this evening. We only accommodate reservations in advance." Henry glanced past him into the dining room. Several tables sat conspicuously empty, their chairs neatly pushed in, gleaming glasses untouched. He looked back at Vincent. "I see there are a few open tables," he observed gently. Vincent's practiced smile hardened. "Those tables are reserved for later parties. We simply cannot seat walk-ins." His tone carried an unspoken but obvious subtext, especially not you. Elizabeth shifted uncomfortably beside Henry, lowering her gaze to the floor. The sensation of being scrutinized prickled at her skin. She could feel it, those subtle glances from nearby tables. A couple near the bar, dressed in glittering evening wear, whispered to each other while darting quick looks in their direction. Another man leaned toward his companion, murmuring something that made her smirk faintly. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed hot. Henry remained composed, though his jaw set faintly as he replied. "It's a special night for us," he said. "I understand your policy, but perhaps there's some flexibility. We'd be happy to wait if needed." Vincent's expression didn't soften. If anything, he seemed to relish the chance to assert control. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," he said crisply. "Maison d'Or has a standard to uphold. We strictly adhere to reservations." The words were spoken loudly enough that a few diners nearby turned their heads more openly now, curious about the exchange. Elizabeth wanted to disappear. She leaned closer to Henry, whispering, "Maybe we should just go, Henry." Before he could answer, a new voice cut through the tension. "What seems to be the problem here?" The crowd parted slightly as a man emerged from the direction of the kitchen. He was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, his white chef's jacket immaculately pressed and embroidered with his name, James Hunt. He walked with the confidence of someone who knew every eye in the room was on him. His hair was dark, slicked back stylishly, and his sharp features bore the faintest trace of a smirk. James's gaze landed on Henry and Elizabeth, lingering as it appraised them, then flicked briefly to Vincent. "Why are these two standing here?" he asked. Vincent straightened slightly, adopting an almost deferential tone. "They don't have a reservation, Chef Hunt." James's smirk deepened as he returned his attention to Henry and Elizabeth. "No reservation?" he repeated, his voice carrying easily across the room. He gestured broadly toward the empty tables, mocking their earlier point. "I suppose you thought you could just walk into Maison d'Or on a Friday night and get a seat?" His words had a theatrical flourish to them, loud enough that patrons nearby chuckled softly. Elizabeth flinched under the weight of those stares. Her hands trembled slightly against Henry's arm. She'd never felt so exposed, as though she were being paraded before an audience. Henry, though, didn't waver. His eyes stayed fixed on James's face, calm and unflinching. "It's our anniversary," Henry said simply. James raised his brows theatrically, as if that were amusing. "Ah, well, congratulations," he said, his tone drenched in false warmth. "But perhaps a more casual venue would be better suited, don't you think?" There was a ripple of laughter from a nearby table. Elizabeth's heart ached with humiliation. Henry said nothing. He only glanced around the dining room again, taking in the details not of the grandeur but of the small things. How the servers moved, the smell drifting faintly from the kitchen, the presentation of dishes on trays carried past. His expression didn't change, but a flicker passed through his eyes. James noticed it and chuckled. "What's the matter?" he said lightly. "Not quite what you expected?" Before Henry could respond, another movement caught his attention. Behind the gleaming glass of the open kitchen window, a young man stood frozen mid-step, watching them. He wore a white apron, his dark hair slightly disheveled, a towel slung over his shoulder. He couldn't have been more than 22. Their eyes met for a brief second. The young man, Michael, felt a strange pull in his chest as he looked at Henry. There was something familiar about his steady posture, his quiet dignity in the face of ridicule, something that didn't fit with the image James was painting for the room. Michael's gaze dropped briefly to Henry's hands, where they rested calmly against his side. He saw it then. The thickened skin across the palms, the fine, pale scars tracing across his knuckles. Those were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime with knives, with heat and steel and fire. Michael's heart gave an odd, small thud. He didn't know who this man was, but he knew instinctively that there was more to him than the room realized. Elizabeth tugged gently at Henry's sleeve again. Her voice was barely above a whisper now, desperate to escape the weight of those watching eyes. "Henry, let's go." Henry nodded once, slow and steady, and turned to face James one last time. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply gave the faintest of smiles, the kind that carried no humor but plenty of meaning. Then, with Elizabeth's arm tucked securely in his, he guided her away from the entrance. As the doors closed behind them and the laughter faded into muffled echoes, Michael felt his stomach twist. He glanced down again at his own hands, then back toward the kitchen, his mind racing with questions. And somewhere outside, as Henry led Elizabeth back into the night, the glimmering lights of Maison d'Or reflected in his eyes. But there was no warmth there, only memory, and a resolve that Elizabeth had seen before, in the man who built their life from nothing. The night air outside was brisk, the kind of chill that sharpened every breath and seemed to strip away the lingering heat of the restaurant's humiliating glow. Henry and Elizabeth stepped out onto the pavement, the door of Maison d'Or swinging closed behind them with a muted finality. For a moment, they simply stood there, side by side, facing the glittering city street. Yellow cabs hissed past in the rain-slicked roadway, and the lights of luxury boutiques glimmered against the darkened glass. Elizabeth clutched Henry's arm tightly, her fingers trembling against his sleeve. "I told you," she whispered, her voice uneven. "We didn't belong in there. I could feel them staring, Henry. Every single one of them." Henry looked down at her, his expression calm but distant, as though his mind had drifted elsewhere. His eyes weren't on the people bustling past or the glow of the city lights. They were fixed back on the restaurant behind them, his gaze lingering on its gleaming facade. There was no anger in his face, nor shame. Only a steady, contemplative focus, the same one he used to wear when he studied a cut of fish or appraised the angle of a blade. Inside Maison d'Or, James Hunt had returned to his kitchen, the taste of triumph lingering as he brushed past his staff. The sous chefs laughed quietly, emboldened by his display. Even Vincent allowed himself a smug smirk as he resumed his post at the entrance. Yet not everyone shared their satisfaction. Michael, the young apprentice, couldn't stop glancing toward the doors even after the couple had gone. There had been something unmistakable in the man's eyes. Calm, deliberate, sharp as a finely honed knife. Michael had seen chefs crumble under James's ridicule, wealthy patrons shrink under his cutting wit, but that old man hadn't flinched. Even as the laughter rippled through the room, he had stood there unbothered, studying everything with an intensity that felt almost dangerous. Michael thought again of his hands, those calloused, scarred hands. They weren't the hands of someone who merely dabbled in kitchens at home. Those were hands that had worked for decades, hands that knew the rhythm of the blade and the feel of fire. Michael's father had been a carpenter, and he remembered those same kinds of marks. Thickened palms, skin like worn leather, the permanent record of a life of craft and labor. He hesitated, glancing toward James, who was now barking orders at his sous chefs. James radiated pride, strutting along the counters as if his humiliation of the couple had been just another performance, part of the restaurant's grand theater. The staff laughed dutifully, falling in line behind his arrogance, but Michael found himself stepping back, his stomach uneasy. Henry, meanwhile, guided Elizabeth slowly down the street, away from the gawking eyes and glittering glass. She kept her gaze lowered, trying to hide the flush in her cheeks. "I don't know why we came here," she said softly, as if the words were meant for herself more than for him. 50 years, Henry. I wanted it to be special." He reached over and placed his hand over hers, stilling her trembling fingers. "It is special," he said quietly. His voice was steady, unshaken. He didn't need to tell her that he'd seen everything, every glance from the patrons, every smirk from the staff, the way James Hunt puffed up his chest like a rooster in his own coop. Henry had noticed the imperfections too, the small, telling details in the food he'd glimpsed as trays passed through the room. A salmon that had lost its sheen, a fillet that hadn't been cut against the grain, mistakes invisible to almost anyone else, but glaring to someone who knew what to look for. Elizabeth studied him as they walked, sensing that familiar stillness in him. It wasn't resignation. She knew her husband too well for that. It was the quiet before something deliberate, something precise. She remembered the years he had built his business from nothing, starting with a single delivery truck and a few contacts at the docks, and how he had worked tirelessly, one connection at a time, until his name meant something. That same calm, disciplined patience was in him now. Back inside, Michael moved to the edge of the kitchen window, peering discreetly into the dining room. The laughter had faded, and most of the patrons had returned to their conversations, their glasses clinking softly in the glow of candlelight. But Michael's eyes kept drifting back to the empty doorway. He imagined the couple out on the street now, walking quietly into the city's cold. His mind returned to an old framed photograph he had once seen, hanging in the restaurant's upstairs office. It was dusty and half forgotten, tucked behind newer accolades and certificates. A black and white image of Maison d'Or's early days. In it, a much younger Lucas Bennett, the restaurant's legendary founder, stood proudly in his chef's whites beside his first staff. Michael remembered thinking how different the place looked then. No chandeliers, no marble floors, just simple tables, warm lighting, and an honest kitchen. And there had been a figure in that photo, too. Standing at the edge of the frame, a young black man with sharp eyes and a faint smile, his chef's apron dusted with flour. Michael hadn't known his name at the time, but now, picturing Henry's steady gaze, he wondered. Henry and Elizabeth paused at the corner, waiting for the light to change. Taxis honked impatiently in the distance, and steam rose from a manhole cover nearby, swirling in the cold night air. Elizabeth glanced up at him, her voice trembling with both frustration and lingering shame. "We should have gone somewhere else," she said again. He turned to her, his hand gently brushing her cheek, and offered the same reassuring smile he always had. "We'll go home soon," he said softly, "but I needed to see it with my own eyes." Elizabeth blinked at him. "See what?" Henry looked back over his shoulder toward the glowing facade of Maison d'Or. His eyes narrowed faintly, not in anger, but in something colder, quieter, like a craftsman examining a flawed piece of work, already envisioning how to correct it. "How far it's fallen," he murmured. Elizabeth frowned, unsure what he meant, but she knew that tone. She'd heard it years ago when a supplier had tried to cheat him out of a contract, and again when he had stared down a banker who refused to give them a loan. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it carried weight. Henry Walker never spoke without purpose. Inside the kitchen, Michael's unease deepened. He found himself distracted through the remainder of the evening rush, his hands clumsy as he plated garnishes and polished silver trays. He could still see that old man's hands in his mind's eye, the practiced steadiness of his movements, even as he simply stood there. That was not the posture of someone intimidated by luxury. That was someone who had been in kitchens, real kitchens, long before James Hunt had ever put on a chef's jacket. Later that night, after the last guest left and the restaurant quieted, Michael stayed behind as the others drifted out. He found himself drawn upstairs to the office, where he flicked on the dim lamp and stared at that old photograph again. He traced his finger lightly over the young man in the picture, the one standing beside Lucas Bennett. He studied the features, the strong brow, the set of his jaw, the faint smile that seemed so familiar now. He whispered to himself, "Who are you?" And outside, Henry and Elizabeth hailed a cab, its headlights cutting through the dark. As they climbed inside, Henry looked back once more at Maison d'Or, its glowing windows reflecting in his eyes like the surface of a still pond. He said nothing, but Elizabeth sensed it. Whatever he had seen in there tonight had stirred something old and unshakable within him. When the cab pulled away, Michael was still in the office staring at the photograph. A strange unease settled over him, one he couldn't explain, but couldn't shake. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the sense that tonight had been the beginning of something, though he didn't yet know what. Henry sat back in the cab, his arm around Elizabeth's shoulders as the city lights blurred past. He felt her lean into him, still quiet, still hurt. He pressed a kiss to her hair and whispered, "We'll make this right." And in his calm, deliberate tone, it didn't sound like a hope. It sounded like a certainty. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the cab filling the silence between Henry and Elizabeth. She rested her head lightly against his shoulder, her fingers curled loosely around his hand. The city slid past outside the window in streaks of neon and shadow, its noise muffled by the glass, but Henry's gaze was fixed inward, steady and calculating. The words exchanged in Maison d'Or replayed in his mind with absolute clarity. Every condescending glance, every patronizing smirk from James Hunt and Vincent, every cruel whisper from the patrons who had watched their humiliation like a performance. Elizabeth felt his stillness, but she didn't speak. She knew this quiet well. When they arrived at their modest home, Henry paid the driver and helped Elizabeth out of the car, his movements slow but purposeful. Inside, the familiar warmth of their living room was a stark contrast to the cold, polished world they had just left. Elizabeth sank onto the couch, exhaling as though she had been holding her breath for hours. She glanced toward Henry, who removed his jacket and draped it carefully over a chair before walking to the small table near the window. The framed clipping of Maison d'Or's early days sat there, the same one he had looked at before they left. He studied it for a long moment, the photograph within it showing a simpler time. Lucas Bennett, smiling, his sleeves rolled up, his kitchen bustling behind him. Henry remembered standing there in that very kitchen, young and hungry to learn, soaking up every word from his mentor like sunlight. He remembered how Lucas had once told him, "A kitchen reflects its leader. Treat your staff with dignity. Treat your guests with warmth, and treat your craft with respect. That's how you build something that lasts." What Henry had seen tonight was none of those things. Maison d'Or had grown richer, grander, shinier, but in its heart it had become something hollow and unrecognizable. He had felt it the moment he stepped inside. The chill of exclusion, the smug pride in its elite clientele, the cold disdain with which they had been treated, despite all the years Henry had quietly supported the very foundations that allowed such places to flourish. Elizabeth's voice broke gently into his thoughts. "Henry," she said softly, "I don't want you to brood over this. It's not worth it. Let's just forget about it and go somewhere else next week. We can have our anniversary dinner somewhere we're wanted." He turned to her and smiled faintly, but there was a weight in his eyes that didn't fade. "Liz," he said quietly, "it's not about the dinner." He sat down beside her, taking her hands gently into his. "It's about what it stood for. Lucas built that place to be welcoming. It wasn't just for the wealthy. It was for anyone who respected good food, anyone who loved the craft. And now, look at it. They don't even see people like us anymore. Just status, just appearances. She searched his face, recognizing the steel in his voice. "Henry, what are you thinking?" He didn't answer her directly. Instead, he rose, crossed the room, and retrieved his phone from the counter. It was old, its screen slightly scratched but functional. He sat back down and scrolled through his contacts until he reached a name near the very top: Walker Foods Headquarters. His thumb hovered over it for a moment, his face calm and resolute. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Henry?" He glanced at her and offered a gentle smile as though to soothe her. "Trust me," he said simply, and then pressed the call button. The line clicked almost immediately, and a warm, professional voice greeted him. "Good evening, Mr. Walker. This is Angela at Walker Foods. How can I assist you?" Henry leaned back, his voice even and steady. "Angela, I need you to connect me with operations. Effective immediately, I want all shipments to Maison d'Or frozen. No deliveries until further notice." There was a pause on the line. "Sir," Angela said cautiously, "that's a major account. Do you want me to inform?" "Yes," Henry interrupted gently but firmly. "Make it formal, full suspension. I'll give the reason myself." Elizabeth's heart skipped, watching her husband in this quiet, commanding mode she hadn't seen in years. It reminded her of when he had first built Walker Foods, back when they had risked everything. Angela's tone shifted, brisk and unquestioning now. "Understood, sir. I'll notify the logistics teams immediately. Do you want me to draft a statement for their management?" "No need," Henry replied. "I'll handle that call personally in the morning." When he hung up, Elizabeth stared at him. "Henry, you're cutting them off?" He turned to her and nodded once, his face unreadable. "That restaurant buys nearly half its fresh fish from us, Liz. Without our shipments, their menu collapses. They've forgotten where their food comes from, who keeps their kitchens running. Maybe it's time they remember." She sat back, stunned but not surprised. Henry had never been loud, never sought revenge in anger, but he had always believed in consequences. He had built his business on quiet strength and relationships, and now that strength was being aimed directly at Maison d'Or. The following morning, the fallout began. In the pre-dawn hours, the kitchen staff of Maison d'Or arrived to find the delivery bay empty. No trucks, no crates of halibut or salmon, no boxes of fresh shellfish. The sous chef cursed under his breath as he dialed the supplier, only to be met with polite but firm refusals. Walker Foods had ceased all deliveries to their account. By mid-morning, James Hunt stormed into his office, phone pressed to his ear as he barked at his manager. "What do you mean we're cut off?" he demanded. "Walker Foods has supplied us for years. Get them back on the line." Across the city, Henry sat in his home office, speaking calmly into his phone as James's frantic calls finally reached him. "Mr. Walker," James said, his tone strained but attempting politeness. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Henry said evenly, his voice calm but implacable. "Maison d'Or will receive no further shipments from Walker Foods, not until I'm satisfied that the treatment my wife and I received last night will never happen to anyone else again." James's voice cracked. "Wait, that was you?" He let out a disbelieving laugh, one tinged with desperation. "You expect me to believe that the man in here last night, the one in those clothes, was Henry Walker?" Henry allowed himself a small, dry smile. "You don't have to believe it, James," he said quietly, "but the trucks will stop regardless." When he ended the call, silence settled back into the room. Elizabeth stood in the doorway watching him with a mix of awe and concern. "Henry," she murmured, "you really did it." He turned toward her, his expression softening. "Liz," he said gently, "I spent 50 years building a business, not just for us, but for the people who care about the work, the craft, the dignity of it. If they think they can strip that away in favor of pomp and cruelty, then they don't deserve what we provide." By noon, the news was spreading. Other suppliers caught wind of Walker Foods' decision and quietly followed suit, unwilling to jeopardize their own relationships with Henry's company. Journalists in the culinary world began murmuring about a supply crisis at one of the city's most celebrated restaurants. Inside Maison d'Or, James and his staff scrambled to source replacements, but nothing matched the quality or speed of Walker's network. Meanwhile, Henry sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching Elizabeth across from him. Her initial worry had softened into a quiet pride. She reached across the table, lacing her fingers with his. "Lucas would be proud of you," she said softly. Henry smiled faintly. "This isn't finished yet," he murmured. And indeed, it was only the beginning. The storm at Maison d'Or had intensified over the course of the next 24 hours. By the following morning, the kitchen was in chaos. Deliveries had not arrived for the second day in a row, and panic was spreading among the staff like fire in a dry field. The sous chefs argued loudly about substitute suppliers, arguing over scraps of quality fish from lesser distributors who could barely meet the restaurant's demands. James Hunt was furious, his voice booming through the halls, berating anyone within earshot, his frustration growing sharper with every phone call that went unanswered. He had tried Henry Walker's line several times that morning, only to be met with curt refusals from Walker Foods' corporate office. The polite but immovable tone of Henry's operations manager made it clear that this was not a misunderstanding, nor a temporary pause. This was punishment. The waitstaff whispered nervously among themselves as patrons began canceling their reservations. Even those who had not witnessed the humiliating scene with Henry and Elizabeth could feel the shift in the air. What had been an untouchable fortress of luxury and refinement now felt suddenly fragile. Within hours, rumors trickled down the culinary grapevine. Walker Foods had severed ties over an incident with a patron. The speculation grew wilder with every retelling, and soon everyone in the kitchen was talking about the sharply dressed elderly black man who had been escorted out 2 nights prior. Michael stayed quiet through it all. He couldn't stop thinking about that man. He had barely slept, his mind tangled in images. The steady way Henry had looked at the kitchen through the glass, the precision in his gaze, the worn marks of a craftsman on his hands. He remembered those calloused fingers as clearly as he remembered his own father's hands after long days in the woodshop, stained and rough from years of shaping wood into beauty. He remembered, too, how Henry had never once bowed his head or broken under James Hunt's sneering words. Michael found himself lingering again in the office upstairs late that afternoon, drawn by an instinct he didn't quite understand. The office was silent, the faint hum of the building's ventilation the only sound. He walked past the framed awards and articles lauding James Hunt's accolades, past the certificates and culinary medals mounted like trophies. His gaze returned, inevitably, to the far wall where the oldest photograph hung slightly crooked, neglected compared to the gleaming frames surrounding it. He stepped closer. The black and white image was grainy, but clear enough to recognize Lucas Bennett in his prime, smiling broadly in his chef's whites, a kitchen bustling behind him. Around him stood his early staff, young and proud, most of their faces now faded with time. But there, at the edge of the frame, stood a young man whose posture was strikingly familiar. His features were unmistakable, even beneath the years. The strong lines of his jaw, the sharpness in his eyes, and the faint smile tugging at his lips. Michael felt his pulse quicken. He leaned in until he could make out the writing beneath the frame. Faded pencil lettering on a plaque long forgotten. Maison d'Or, 1974. Chef Lucas Bennett with his founding team. And next to it, names inscribed carefully in neat script. Lucas Bennett, Ann Duval, Marco Ortiz, and finally, Henry Walker. Michael's breath caught in his throat. There it was, the proof of what his instincts had been screaming since that night. Henry Walker hadn't simply been another diner. He had been part of this place, part of its earliest history, standing beside its legendary founder long before James Hunt had even set foot in a kitchen. And, if the news reports were true, Henry Walker was also the Henry Walker, head of Walker Foods, the man whose company supplied half the high-end restaurants in the city. Michael sat back in the old office chair, staring at the photo as everything settled into place. He understood now why Henry had looked at the kitchen the way he did, why he'd seemed immune to James's arrogance, why his words had carried that quiet authority. This wasn't some coincidence. Henry Walker wasn't simply a patron wronged. He was a man whose roots in the culinary world ran deeper than anyone here could grasp. Driven by a mixture of awe and unease, Michael pulled out his phone and searched for Walker Foods headquarters. It wasn't far from the river, in a sleek, modern building that bore no resemblance to the small, scrappy warehouse it had started from decades earlier. He hesitated, glancing back at the kitchen downstairs where James Hunt was still raging. Then he made his choice. 2 hours later, he stood in the lobby of Walker Foods, his heart pounding in his chest. The building smelled faintly of fresh coffee and lemon polish, its white marble floors gleaming under bright overhead lights. The receptionist, a poised woman in a navy blazer, looked up from her desk and smiled warmly. "Good evening," she greeted him. "Do you have an appointment?" Michael cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how nervous he must look in his kitchen whites, still faintly marked with the day's toil. No, I don't. But I need to see Mr. Henry Walker. Please tell him it's about Maison d'Or." Something flickered in her expression. Not surprise, but recognition. She picked up her phone without further question, dialed an extension, and spoke softly. After a moment, she hung up and smiled at him again. "Mr. Walker will see you now. Take the elevator to the top floor." Michael swallowed hard and followed her directions. The ride up felt interminable, the elevator walls gleaming with polished metal that reflected his anxious face back at him. When the doors opened, he stepped into a wide corridor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. At the end of the hall stood an office door slightly ajar, light spilling out. He approached, knocked softly, and heard a calm voice invite him in. Henry Walker sat behind a wide oak desk, dressed sharply in a charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, though his posture remained as relaxed and steady as it had been the night Michael first saw him. His expression was one of mild curiosity, but there was no trace of anger or resentment. If anything, he seemed quietly amused by the sight of the young man standing nervously in his doorway. "Michael, isn't it?" Henry said, his deep voice carrying warmth rather than judgment. "Come in, son." Michael stepped inside hesitantly. The office walls were lined with shelves of books and framed photographs, images of fishing docks, markets, and kitchens from decades past. On the far wall hung another photo of Lucas Bennett, this one clearer, showing Henry beside him, both men younger and proud, beaming over a counter lined with plates. Michael swallowed. I saw the photo. In the restaurant office. You were there. You were part of Maison d'Or when it started. Henry's gaze softened, tinged with nostalgia. I was, he said simply. Lucas gave me my start. He taught me the craft, the discipline, and the respect for the work. Back then, it was a place where anyone with a love for food could belong. Michael hesitated, then spoke in a rush, his voice edged with regret. I'm sorry, I didn't speak up that night. I wanted to. I could see how wrong it was, but I froze. Everyone else was laughing, and James? He trailed off, shaking his head. You didn't deserve that. Neither did your wife. Henry leaned back in his chair, studying him quietly. Then he smiled, small but genuine. You saw what others didn't. That counts for something. He gestured toward a chair opposite his desk. Sit down, Michael. Michael obeyed, sitting stiffly on the edge of the seat. Henry folded his hands on the desk. You're young, he said. I can see it in your face and your hands. But you noticed. That's more than I can say for most of that kitchen. Tell me, why do you cook? The question caught Michael off guard, but he answered honestly. Because I love it. Because when I cook, it feels like I'm building something real, something that matters. I want to learn how to do it right. Not just fancy plates and trends, but the real thing. Henry nodded slowly, his eyes sharp with a quiet appraisal. Lucas used to say the same thing. Cooking isn't about the stars on the door or the suits in the dining room. It's about respect. For the ingredients, for the craft, and for the people you serve. Michael's throat tightened. Teach me, he said suddenly, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Please. I don't want to be like them. I want to learn the way you learned. Henry studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he rose from his seat and extended a hand. Michael stood and grasped it firmly. All right, Henry said. Come back tomorrow morning. We'll start early. If you're serious about this, you'll learn what it really means to cook. Michael felt something spark in his chest, a sense of purpose, of hope. As he left the office, he glanced back to see Henry standing by the window, looking out over the city lights with Elizabeth at his side. She had entered quietly during their conversation, her warm smile directed at Michael as if to reassure him. And in that moment, Michael understood that this was not just about him learning from Henry. This was about something larger, restoring what had been lost, reclaiming a craft from arrogance and pretension, and carrying forward a legacy rooted in respect and dignity. The following morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that arrives just before dawn, when the city had not yet fully awakened. Michael stood outside the glass doors of Walker Foods, the air cool against his face, his nerves twisting in anticipation. His kitchen whites were clean and pressed, though his hands betrayed his anxious energy, clenching and unclenching at his sides. The skyline glowed faintly with the first hints of sunrise, casting pale gold across the river and the towering buildings that marked the heart of the city. He checked the time again. 5:30. Henry's voice echoed in his mind from the night before. Come early. If you're serious, we start before the sun does. There had been no hesitation in Henry's tone, no coddling reassurance. It wasn't an invitation, it was a challenge. Michael had spent most of the night replaying those words, determined not to waste the chance he'd been given. When the doors unlocked and opened from the inside, Henry himself appeared. He wore no suit this time, only a crisp white apron tied neatly over a dark shirt, his sleeves rolled to his elbows. Despite his age, there was an unmistakable strength in his posture, a grounded confidence that seemed to command the room around him even in silence. He gave Michael a small nod of approval. "You're on time," Henry said, his voice deep and steady. "That's good. Punctuality is respect, for the craft, for the work, and for those who came before you. Come in." Michael followed him through the empty lobby and down a corridor that led not to offices, but to a side wing he hadn't known existed. Henry pushed open a door and Michael stopped short. It was a kitchen, but unlike any Michael had seen. It wasn't sprawling or industrial like the one at Maison d'Or. It was intimate, meticulously organized, every station spotless and gleaming under the soft light. Marble counters ran along the walls, each perfectly laid out with tools sharpened and aligned. Fresh fish and produce rested in neatly labeled bins, their quality immediately apparent even at a glance. At the center stood a single long counter with a small row of stools. Like a private chef's table, "This is where I come when I want to remember why I started," Henry said simply, crossing to the counter and placing a hand on its polished surface. "I built this kitchen years ago before Walker Foods grew the way it has now. It's not about business here. It's about the work itself." Elizabeth appeared then, carrying a tray of tea. Her smile was warm, easing some of Michael's nerves. "Good morning," she said gently, setting the tray down near the stools. "You must be Michael. Henry's told me about you." Michael offered a polite nod, though he felt unworthy of her kindness. "Good morning, ma'am. Thank you for letting me be here." "Call me Elizabeth," she replied. "And don't be nervous. You're here because Henry sees something in you." Henry gestured to the sink. "First lesson," he said, his tone firm but not harsh. "Cleanliness is discipline. Wash your hands properly. From there, we begin." Michael obeyed quickly, scrubbing his hands under the warm water, the ritual grounding him. When he turned back, Henry had already laid out a whole salmon on the counter, its silver scales gleaming under the light. Beside it, he placed a long, razor-sharp filleting knife. "Tell me what you see," Henry instructed. Michael stepped closer, studying the fish. "The eyes are clear. The flesh looks firm. It's fresh, probably caught yesterday." Henry gave a slight approving nod. "Good. Most chefs glance at a label and never bother looking closer. But if you can't read a fish, you have no business serving it. Respect begins here." With fluid precision, Henry picked up the knife and demonstrated, his movements smooth and controlled. He spoke as he worked, his voice calm but commanding attention. "When you cut, you don't fight the fish, you follow it. The blade should move as if it's listening to what's already there, not forcing it." Michael watched in silence, entranced. Each stroke of the knife was seamless, reducing the fish to flawless, glistening fillets with barely a sound. There was an artistry to it that he'd never seen in Maison d'Or's kitchen, where speed and showmanship often replaced quiet mastery. When Henry handed him the second knife, Michael hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. His hands were steady, his breath measured as he mirrored what he'd seen. Henry observed without interfering, his sharp eyes catching every detail. "Too much pressure," Henry said at last, adjusting Michael's grip. "You're forcing it. Relax. Let the knife do its job." Michael corrected himself, and this time the blade slid cleanly, the flesh parting perfectly. He felt a rush of satisfaction, glancing up to see Henry's approving nod. "Better," Henry said. "Again." And so it went for hours. They moved from fish to vegetables, to knife skills and plating, each task accompanied by Henry's quiet but deliberate instruction. He corrected Michael gently but firmly, never letting a mistake pass unaddressed, yet always explaining why. There was no arrogance in his tone, only the voice of a man who had walked this path for decades and wanted it passed on properly. Elizabeth watched from the sidelines, occasionally stepping forward with tea or wiping down the counters between exercises. Her presence was a comfort and balance to Henry's rigorous guidance, her soft words reminding Michael to breathe, to focus, to trust the process. By midday, Michael's shoulders ached. His hands tingled from the unfamiliar repetition, but there was a spark in his chest he hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of learning something real, something that mattered. Henry paused at last, wiping his hands on a towel. "You've got good instincts," he said, his voice measured. "You've been watching more than you realize. That's the mark of someone who can be taught." Michael exhaled, relieved at the praise. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to explain it, but this feels different than anything I've learned before. In the restaurant, it's all speed and plating and impressing critics. Here, it feels honest." Henry smiled faintly, glancing toward the photograph of Lucas Bennett that hung on the far wall. "That's because this is how it used to be. Before the stars, before the investors, before it all became about prestige. Lucas used to say, 'Feed the soul, not the ego.'" Elizabeth placed a hand on Henry's shoulder then, her expression tender. "And now, you're passing that on." Henry looked at Michael, his gaze steady. "This isn't about revenge on Maison d'Or. It's about restoring what's been lost. If you're serious about learning, I'll teach you. Not for me, not even for you, but for the craft itself. Someday, you'll teach it to someone else." Michael swallowed hard, his voice quiet but certain. "I'm serious. I want this." Henry extended his hand, the same way he had the night before. Michael grasped it firmly, sealing an unspoken promise between them. In the weeks that followed, their routine became constant. Every morning before dawn, Michael came to Henry's private kitchen. He learned to butcher fish with precision, to roll dough so thin it was almost translucent, to coax flavor out of the simplest ingredients without drowning them in excess. Henry taught him patience, discipline, and, most of all, respect for the ingredients, the tools, and the people who would one day eat what he prepared. As winter crept closer, news of Maison d'Or's decline spread quietly through the culinary world. Without Walker Foods, its menu faltered. Critics noticed. Patrons drifted away. Eventually, whispers of its troubles turned into headlines. Maison d'Or facing crisis amid supply scandal. Michael read those headlines but felt no triumph. His focus was here, in this quiet kitchen where legacy was being rebuilt. One morning, after finishing a flawless service of practice dishes, Henry placed a hand on Michael's shoulder and nodded toward the counter. A single pristine knife lay there, its handle worn smooth with age. "This was my first," Henry said softly. "Lucas gave it to me when he said I was ready. Now I'm giving it to you. Take care of it. It's not just steel. It's a reminder of what this work means." Michael picked it up reverently, feeling the weight of it in his palm. "I won't let you down," he said. Henry smiled, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "I know you won't. One day, when you're ready, you'll pass it on." Elizabeth, standing nearby, clasped her hands together, her voice gentle and proud. Lucas would be smiling now, and I know I am. The city outside bustled on, but in that small kitchen, time seemed to slow. The past, present, and future converged in quiet harmony. Henry's journey had come full circle, his craft now alive again in the hands of a new generation. And as Michael looked at Henry and Elizabeth, he understood that this was more than mentorship. It was a family born of shared purpose, of dignity restored, and of a promise that what was good and true in their world would never be lost again. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Share this video with your friends, and check out our other videos for more